September 4th, 2025, a Tallahassee courtroom. 75-year-old Donna Adelson heard the word guilty and collapsed into tears. The FBI's own data puts women her age at the very bottom of every violent crime table. The statistics said grandmothers were the safest people in any room. The records behind 10 of these cases said something else entirely. These are 10 grandmothers who committed cold-blooded murder. Case 1. Donna Adelson. The morning of July 18, 2014 was a Friday. At around 11 a.m., a car turned into the garage of a home on Trescott Drive. The driver was Dan Markell, 41 years old, a law professor at Florida State University. He had been at the gym. Before that, he had dropped his 2 young sons at preschool. He was on a phone call when he pulled in. He told whoever was on the other end of the line that there was someone in his driveway he did not recognize. Then the call went silent. A neighbor heard sounds he would later describe as possibly gunshots. When he went to investigate, Markell was slumped in the driver's seat, unresponsive. The window on the driver's side had been shattered. There was blood across his head and face. The engine was still running. The neighbor ran back to his own house and called 911, telling the operator what he had found. By the time paramedics arrived, Markell had suffered 2 gunshot wounds to the head. He was rushed to a local hospital. He died the following day, July 19, 2014. He was 41 years old. Dan Markell had spent most of his adult life building something in the world of legal scholarship. He was born in Toronto, Canada, and raised there, and carried that background into an academic career that by any measure had become significant. He had studied politics and philosophy at Harvard as an undergraduate, then spent time doing graduate work in political philosophy at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the University of Cambridge, before returning to Harvard for law school. He graduated with high honors in 2001. From there, he clerked for a federal appellate judge on the Ninth Circuit, then joined a Washington law firm where he worked on white-collar criminal defense cases. He moved into teaching in 2005 when he joined the FSU law faculty, received tenure in 2010, and by 2014 held an endowed professorship. His academic focus was criminal law theory, retribution, punishment, the question of what it means for a state to impose consequences on individuals. He wrote for elite law reviews and for general audiences alike, publishing opinion pieces in the New York Times and The Atlantic. His students described him as accessible and generous with his time. He had also co-authored a book examining the relationship between family ties and criminal justice outcomes. A professor who spent his career thinking carefully about the law and what it required of people and institutions, had become the victim of a premeditated killing arranged by the family of his ex-wife. Markell had married Wendy Adelson, also a member of the FSU faculty. The marriage began deteriorating around 2012. Wendy filed for divorce, and by 2013, the proceedings had become deeply contested, centered significantly on custody arrangements for their 2 sons. The boys were young. Markell wanted to remain present in their lives and was fighting actively through the court system to ensure that. Wendy came from a prominent South Florida family based out of the Boca Raton area. Her mother, Donna Adelson, and her brother, Charlie Adelson, a practicing dentist, ran the family's dental practice together. They were wealthy, established, and tightly knit as a family unit. Prosecutors, across years of investigation and multiple trials, laid out the argument that Donna Adelson could not tolerate watching the custody battle continue. As long as Dan Markell had legal standing over his children, as long as he was pressing his case through the courts, he remained a permanent and unwelcome fixture in the family's life. The theory put forward at trial was that Donna and Charlie had decided to remove that problem by removing Markell. Charlie, according to the prosecution, worked through his former girlfriend, a woman named Catherine Magbanua, who in turn connected with 2 men from the Miami area named Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera. Garcia and Rivera traveled from South Florida to Tallahassee, conducted surveillance on Markell's movements, and were waiting when he pulled into his garage on that Friday morning. The investigation that followed was long and intricate. Tallahassee police pulled surveillance footage from Markell's gym on the day of the killing and identified a Toyota Prius that had followed his car out of the parking lot. That vehicle became a thread that investigators pulled for 2 years before making the first arrests. Luis Rivera was the first person charged. He eventually accepted a plea deal, cooperated with investigators, and was sentenced to additional prison time on top of a prior federal sentence. Sigfredo Garcia went to trial, was convicted of first-degree murder, and received a life sentence. Both men had purchased cars and other items in the weeks after the killing, and investigators tracked those expenditures as part of building the financial picture of the plot. Catherine Magbanua's path through the courts was longer. Her first trial, in 2019, ended in a hung jury. A second trial was held in 2021. Investigators had documented that after Markel's murder, Magbanua began receiving regular paychecks from the Adelson family dental practice. In the 16 months following the killing, she deposited more than $41,000 in cash and more than $17,000 in checks from that practice into her bank accounts, with deposits made frequently in incremental amounts through ATMs. She was convicted at the second trial and sentenced to life without parole in July 2022. Charlie Adelson's arrest came later. The FBI had conducted what investigators described as a bump operation in the years following the murder. An undercover agent made contact with Charlie, posing as someone who had knowledge of the killing and who wanted money in exchange for silence. The conversations that followed, recorded by the FBI, became central evidence. There were also wiretaps authorized by federal courts that captured further communications. A former girlfriend told police that Charlie had mentioned, before the murder, looking into having Markel killed and putting the cost at roughly $15,000. Charlie went to trial in the fall of 2023. On November 6 of that year, a jury found him guilty on all 3 counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy, and solicitation. He was sentenced to life in prison. 7 days after that verdict, law enforcement turned its attention to Donna. In the period following Charlie's conviction, Donna had been calling the jail where her son was held. Jail phone lines carry a standard recorded warning that calls are monitored. On a call placed the day after Charlie's verdict, Donna was speaking with others in the room around her when she apparently believed she had ended the connection. The line had not been ended. What followed was captured in its entirety. Donna was heard discussing research she and her husband Harvey had conducted into countries that do not have extradition arrangements with the United States. She mentioned Vietnam, Korea, and China as places they had looked at. She described making decisions about trusts for her grandchildren. She spoke about being exhausted and wanting to sleep. She and Harvey had obtained rushed visas and booked one-way tickets to Vietnam, with a layover in Dubai. The tickets were one-way. When FBI Special Agent Patrick Sanford confirmed the flight plans, law enforcement moved within hours. On the evening of November 13, 2023, agents intercepted Donna and Harvey at Miami International Airport while they were on the jetway, steps from the aircraft. Officers arrested Donna for murder, conspiracy, and solicitation. Bodycam footage that later became public showed her moving to pocket her cell phone as agents approached, telling an officer that her attorney had instructed her not to surrender the device. The officer told her there were no phones and took it as evidence. Harvey, who was not charged, stood on the jetway nearby while his wife was handcuffed and led away. He was allowed to keep her jewelry. Donna Adelson was 73 years old on the night of her arrest. She was held for nearly 2 years before her trial began. She attended multiple pre-trial hearings and fought through her attorneys to be released on bond, at one point describing at length the difficult conditions of confinement, assaults she said she had suffered in the general population, inadequate medical care, the disorientation of moving through different housing units. Her requests for bond were denied. Trial began on August 19, 2025. In the first week, prosecutors called Donna's own children to the stand. Wendy Adelson testified. So did her brother Robert. The jury heard from FBI Special Agent Sanford about the airport intercept and the recorded jail calls. Then came evidence that no one who followed the case had encountered in prior trials. A planner from 2014 that Donna's own former legal counsel had dropped off at the state attorney's office. Inside the back of that planner was a handwritten note containing Dan Markel's vehicle information, the make of his car, the model, and the license plate number. The note had been written before the killing. Markel had been shot while seated inside that car. 2 women who had been held at the same detention facility as Donna during her pre-trial incarceration also testified for the state. The first said that Donna had told her directly, during their time together inside, that she had done what the charges alleged. The second described Donna providing her with a written script, a set of questions and answers that Donna had prepared and wanted the woman to use on the witness stand in her defense. That second inmate declined to participate and came forward instead to testify for the prosecution. Investigators had also examined the WhatsApp messages found on Donna's phone after her airport arrest. The messages included communications with a contact in Vietnam. The defense built its argument around distance. Donna had no direct contact, they said, with the men who drove to Tallahassee and pulled the trigger. Whatever she may have known or wanted or discussed, the chain of action ran through others, and what ran through her, at most, was the behavior of a controlling and emotionally invested mother who had involved herself in her children's lives in ways that were unhealthy but fell short of murder. The defense framed her in court as a meddler, not a murderer. The jury deliberated for a little over 3 hours. On September 4, 2025, Judge Stephen Everett read the verdicts aloud in the courtroom in Tallahassee. Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of conspiracy, guilty of solicitation. When he read the first of those 3 words, Donna Adelson gasped loudly and began shaking. She wept openly and uncontrollably. The judge sent the jury out of the room and told Donna she had 2 minutes to collect herself, that there would be no further outbursts in front of the panel. Sentencing followed on October 13, 2025. The mandatory sentence for a first-degree murder conviction in Florida left no discretion. Donna Adelson was sentenced to life in prison. The case had run 11 years from the morning Dan Markel's car pulled into the garage on Trescott Drive. In that time, 5 people had been convicted in connection with the killing: Rivera, Garcia, Magbanua, Charlie, and finally, Donna. Dan Markel's parents, who had followed every trial from Toronto, expressed their gratitude to investigators and prosecutors after the verdict. His 2 sons, who were toddlers in the summer of 2014, were adolescents by the time their grandmother was convicted. Markel spent his career writing about what punishment means and what purpose it is supposed to serve. He did not survive to see the answer in his own case, but the courts, over 11 years, eventually arrived at one. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From a gated community in California, we move next to the story of a grandmother who also came prepared with a loaded gun, also stopped twice before the job was done, and also told police she had no regrets. The difference is what happened in the 6 hours between the shooting and the arrest. Case 2. Cynthia Kedabaka Fallbrook sits in the hills of northern San Diego County, far enough from the coast that it carries a different character from the beach cities to the south. The land there is drier, the neighborhoods more spread out, and a stretch of it is given over to what locals call gated communities, planned developments with names and guards and a particular idea of what quiet suburban life should look like. Pepper Tree Park was one of those places. The houses on Braemar Terrace were large and well-maintained, set behind a gate, with pools in the backyards, and the kind of atmosphere that tends to suggest nothing much goes wrong here. On the morning of February 11, 2014, neighbors on that street began calling 911 in quick succession. One had been in her bathroom doing her hair when she heard what sounded like gunfire coming from outside. She opened a window. She could hear someone calling for help, then more shots. Another neighbor counted 5 shots, then heard screaming, then 3 more, then more after that. The calls piled up on the dispatcher's line one after another, all from the same street, all describing the same sounds. When deputies arrived at a house on Braemar Terrace, they found Guillermo Flores Eustaquio dead inside. He was 53 years old. He had been shot 12 times. Guillermo Eustaquio was the third of 8 children in a close-knit Filipino-American family. Those who knew him well described him as quick-witted and generous, someone who kept the energy up in any room he entered. He had built a life in Fallbrook that was, by most measures, a full one. He worked as a real estate agent and separately served as a technical sergeant with the California Air National Guard, where he worked as a space orbital analyst after joining in 2007. He also coached rugby for young players in the area, including kids from a local middle school. He had 4 children in total, 2 with his wife Laura Salinas, an older son from a previous relationship, and the household also included a teenage daughter. The family lived together in the Pepper Tree Park house, a spacious property with a pool in the back. Also living there, in an apartment above the garage known as the Granny Flat, was Laura's mother. Cynthia Kedabaka had moved in years earlier, initially because she needed care following a stroke. The arrangement had seemed reasonable at the time, even generous. Gio had agreed to it and had opened his home. But the arrangement had never been easy, and the tensions that built inside that household across years of shared space would eventually consume it entirely. The friction between Guillermo and Cynthia touched on several things. He was strict about discipline and expected a particular standard of behavior from the people in his home. He did not want smoking inside or near the children. Cynthia smoked. By some accounts, their arguments over this reached the point where Geode, who had a swimming pool and a garden hose, would spray water on her when he caught her smoking on the back patio. Their approaches to raising children were different in fundamental ways. Cynthia believed in pampering her grandchildren. Gioward believed in high expectations and firm consequences. He had broken one of his son's electronics during an argument. He had also, at some point during the years they shared the house, disposed of an urn containing the ashes of Cynthia's late husband. In November 2013, Cynthia saw what she later described as bruises on her daughter Laura's arm. She became convinced Gioward had put them there. From that point forward, according to later accounts, she stopped leaving the house with any intention of returning to her own place. She stayed, and the anger that had been building across years of small conflicts and daily frictions settled into something harder and more deliberate. 2 weeks before the morning of February 11, 2014, Cynthia Kidabaka went out and bought a .38 caliber 5-shot revolver. The morning she used it was her 63rd birthday. Gioward and Cynthia were the only two people in the house. Laura and the children had already left. The family had plans to attend a spelling bee that day, a school event for Gioward's daughter. The two of them were getting ready to go. What happened next, in the moments before the first shot, was established through Cynthia's own account to police after her arrest. Gioward looked at what she was wearing and told her she could not go out dressed like that. According to what Cynthia relayed to investigators, he said she looked ghetto. He told her to change her clothes. Cynthia went upstairs to her apartment above the garage. She came back down with the revolver. She found Gioward outside on the patio and fired 5 shots at him. He did not die. He was hit but remained mobile, and he began trying to get back inside the house. Cynthia walked to her car, opened the cylinder, reloaded the 5-shot revolver and came back. She fired 5 more rounds. He had made it inside the house, but had not made it to safety. She reloaded again. She fired 5 more rounds, through and into the doorway, into the house, until she had fired 15 rounds total, 12 of them connected. Gioward Eustachio died on the floor of the home he had built for his family. What Cynthia Kidabaka did in the hours that followed is part of what made the case so difficult to hear at trial. She did not call for help. She did not stay. She did not go to a neighbor or wait for police. She drove to a Denny's restaurant in Fallbrook and had breakfast. After breakfast, she went to a casino and gambled for a while. Then she went to her favorite coffee shop on Main Street. That is where sheriff's deputies found her and took her into custody that afternoon, on her 63rd birthday, hours after the shooting. She initially told investigators she did not know what had happened to Gioward. Then she changed course and confessed. The videotaped portion of that confession showed something investigators and jurors later said stayed with them. At one point, describing the shooting, Cynthia raised her arms. She had learned, during the hours she was out, that Gioward had not survived. Prosecutors later told the jury that her reaction to that news was not grief. When asked by investigators what she would do if Gioward were somehow still alive, Cynthia said she would shoot him again. The case moved slowly through the courts. Cynthia was found competent to stand trial in August 2014, more than 2.5 years after the shooting. When the trial finally began in early 2017, the prosecution presented the sequence of events in methodical detail. Deputy District Attorney Keith Watanabe walked the jury through the purchases: the gun bought 2 weeks before the morning in question, the extra ammunition that allowed her to reload twice. He described the geometry of the shooting: outside in the patio, then at the car where she reloaded, then back toward the house, then through the doorway. He told the jury that this was not a woman who had lost control in a moment of passion. Every step in that sequence, he said, was planned. The word he used was premeditated. The defense drew on a different account of the years leading up to that morning. William Stone, Cynthia's attorney, presented her as a woman who had watched her daughter absorb 13 years of verbal and physical abuse from a controlling husband, who had seen bruises on her daughter's arm, who had watched her grandchildren grow up under a father who ruled the house with fear and anger. Stone asked the jury to consider a verdict of voluntary manslaughter rather than first-degree murder, arguing that Cynthia had not planned the killing so much as finally fractured under the weight of what she had witnessed. He told jurors that she had snapped. Laura Salinas sat in the middle of all of it, in a position that had no good options. She had lost her husband, and her mother had been the one to kill him. She testified for the defense. She described what she said was a pattern of verbal and physical abuse during the marriage: the broken electronics, the water hose, behavior she characterized as demeaning and controlling. She spoke about a man who had imposed his rules on everyone inside the house, including her mother. She also came to the sentencing hearing and said, simply, that she loved her mother and she had loved Gioward, and there was nothing about this that felt like a win for anyone. Gioward's family sat on the other side of that same grief. His sister Gionisa Harris had spoken to reporters shortly after the arrest, describing how Gia Ward had opened his home to Cynthia after her stroke, making sure she had a place to live and family around her. She described her brother as someone who had strict rules but whose house was run for a reason. His adult sons, Jordan and Keanu, gave interviews in the days after the shooting. They said their father had been tough but fair, that he pushed them because he cared about where they ended up. They said they felt betrayed by the woman who had been part of their family, who had lived in their home, who had eaten at the same table. Jordan said she had put on a good facade for years. The jury deliberated across 3 days in February 2017. They came back with a verdict of first-degree murder. At the sentencing hearing on March 23, 2017, Cynthia Tudibuka spoke briefly. She apologized, though the words came haltingly and without the clarity that those who had gathered to hear them might have needed. Gia Ward's sister addressed the court with a different tone entirely. She described her brother as someone stolen away by someone she called a cold-blooded murderer. Gia Ward's brother George spoke as well. He said that every time his brother's name was said aloud, he broke down. He said he chose forgiveness. Even so, Cynthia Tudibuka was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison. She was 66 years old at sentencing. A 50-year minimum means she would need to be more than 100 years old before becoming eligible for parole. She had purchased the gun 2 weeks before the morning of February 11, 2014. She had carried it down from the apartment above the garage, walked across the yard, fired 5 shots, walked back to her car, opened the cylinder, reloaded, walked back, fired 5 more, reloaded again, and fired 5 more through the door. Then she had gone to Denny's and ordered breakfast. The prosecution told the jury that every single one of those steps, from the gun purchase to the reload to the drive to the restaurant, was the behavior of a woman who had decided, in advance, what she was going to do. Not on the morning of her birthday, not in the heat of an argument about what she was wearing, but sometime in the 2 weeks before any of it, when she walked into a store and bought the means to do it. The jury agreed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From the hills of Fallbrook, we move to the flatlands of Minnesota, where a grandmother of 5 was known in her small town for her cooking, her bowling league, and the gifts she brought her grandchildren. In the spring of 2018, police found her husband dead in their home, and she had already been gone for hours. Case 3. Lois Reese. Blooming Prairie is a small town in southern Minnesota, about 80 miles south of Minneapolis, set in flat farming country where the winters are long and the summers come with a kind of relief. Fewer than 2,000 people live there, the kind of place where everyone tends to know everyone else's routines, where faces at the diner and the bowling alley and the local gas station are all familiar ones. Lois Reese was one of those faces. She had been part of the community fabric for years, running a daycare from her home, competing in the local bowling league, cooking for her family and bringing food to neighbors. She had 5 grandchildren and was known, by all the accounts people later gave, as someone who genuinely delighted in them, who brought them gifts and stayed close to their lives. Her husband David ran a wax worm farm on the edge of town. The two had been married for decades. They were, by every surface appearance, a settled couple in a settled life. On the evening of March 23, 2018, the Blooming Prairie Police Department sent 2 officers to the Reese home to perform a welfare check. Family members had raised concerns. They had not been able to reach David. What the officers found when they entered the house was a body in the bathroom. David Reese, 54 years old, had been shot twice. He had been dead for an estimated 12 days. A blanket had been placed over him. A window in the bathroom had been left open. Lois was not there. What investigators pieced together in the following days reached back to March 11, 2018, 12 days before the body was found. According to Lois's own account, later given in documentary interviews and court proceedings, she and David had argued that night over something that had happened at one of their grandson's basketball games. The argument escalated. Lois has stated that during that argument, David handed her a loaded .22 caliber handgun and told her to use it on herself. Whatever passed between them in those moments, the outcome was not disputed. Lois shot David twice with that gun, in their home, and he died. She covered him with a blanket. Then she left. Before she drove away from Blooming Prairie, she went to David's business account. She had already, in the days preceding the shooting, deposited 2 forged checks into his personal account, totaling more than $9,000. On the morning of March 23rd, the same day police found the body, she cashed 3 more checks for a total of $11,000, taking the money in cash. She loaded her white Cadillac Escalade and began driving south. The route she took over the weeks that followed was documented in pieces by surveillance cameras at casinos across multiple states. She stopped at the Diamond Joe Casino in Northwood, Iowa, shortly after leaving Minnesota. She stopped at others as she continued south. At one of those stops, records later indicated she won $29,000 at the slots. Gambling had been the central organizing pressure in Lois Reese's life for years, a fact that those around her had only partially understood. Her son Braden later said his mother had battled a serious addiction. Court records from 2015 showed that she had been investigated for theft after authorities found evidence she had been stealing money from her disabled sister. No criminal charges were filed, but a civil court ordered her to pay that sister $100,000. The debts had accumulated, the money had drained out. The worm farm and the bowling league and the daycare had not been enough to cover what the casinos had taken. She drove to Fort Myers Beach, Florida, a barrier island community on the Gulf Coast popular with retirees and seasonal visitors. She parked herself at the Marina Village Resort and began spending time in the bars and restaurants along the waterfront, in the way that someone on vacation would. She was 56 years old, silver-haired, with a particular physical appearance, a specific build, a specific complexion, a specific coloring. She was looking for someone who matched those characteristics. She found Pamela Hutchinson at a happy hour on April 5, 2018. Hutchinson was 59 years old, from Bradenton, Florida. She had recently gone through a divorce and had come to Fort Myers Beach to help a friend scatter her late husband's ashes on nearby Sanibel Island. She had decided to stay a few extra days in the area, renting a short-term unit at the Marina Village condominiums. Surveillance footage from the Smokin' Oyster Brewery captured the first images of the two women together that evening, sitting at the bar, talking, laughing, with every appearance of two strangers getting along easily. The footage showed Lois animated and engaged, leaning in, smiling, her silver hair moving as she talked. To anyone watching, it looked like two people having a good evening. Over the following day, Lois and Pamela spent time together. Witnesses later described seeing them talking, walking back toward the condominiums together late that night. Pamela Hutchinson was never seen alive again. When condo staff performed door-to-door checks at the Marina Village on April 9th, responding to a water issue in the building, they found Pamela's unit. The door was closed. There was a towel pushed into the crack under the bathroom door. There was a strong odor of decomposition coming from inside. The air conditioning had been turned down low. Pamela Hutchinson was in the bathroom, dead of a gunshot wound. She had been shot at least once with a small caliber weapon. Based on the state of the body, she had been dead for several days. Before or after the killing, someone had placed a call to the front desk posing as Pamela, asking to extend the stay by 3 more days. That someone had already left with Pamela's credit cards, her driver's license and identification, her white Acura TL sedan, and access to her bank accounts. Using Pamela's identity documents, Lois had walked into a bank and withdrawn $5,000 in cash. Security cameras captured her using Pamela's cards at casinos and hotels as she drove north and then west. Investigators, now connecting the Florida scene to the Minnesota case, noted the similarities in method. In both cases, the victim had been shot with a small caliber weapon. In both cases, the body had been left in a bathroom with towels positioned to slow the spread of smell. Ballistics testing later confirmed that the same firearm had been used in both killings. Law enforcement released Lois's photograph publicly. Under Sheriff Carmine Marcino of Lee County gave an interview in which he described her as someone who looked like anybody's mother or grandmother, but who had demonstrated a capacity for killing that law enforcement was taking seriously. A nationwide alert went out. She was considered armed and dangerous. There was a near miss in Fort Myers. A woman named Tess Costa, who lived between Minnesota and Florida, spotted Lois standing outside her own home in Fort Myers, apparently having pulled up to the wrong address. The two women made eye contact. Lois said something to the effect that she had the wrong house and drove away quickly. Costa called 911 immediately, but found herself passed between Minnesota and Florida authorities who disputed jurisdiction. The delay cost time. Lois was already gone. Security footage placed her at a Hilton hotel in Ocala, in central Florida, days after the Fort Myers Beach killing. She was using Pamela Hutchinson's name, driving Pamela's car, spending Pamela's money. She moved west across the Florida Panhandle and eventually into Texas, staying at resorts and hotels along the Gulf Coast, continuing to gamble. She was sitting at a table inside Dirty Al's restaurant on South Padre Island, Texas, on April 19, 2018, when the restaurant manager recognized her. George Higginbotham had seen Lois's photograph on CBS This Morning that day. When she walked in, he looked at her and looked at the photograph and made the call. United States Marshals arrived and arrested her at the table. She had been on the run for 27 days since David's body was discovered. She had traveled through at least 6 states. In a Florida court, Lois Reese pleaded guilty to the first-degree murder of Pamela Hutchinson. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was extradited to Minnesota, where she faced charges in David's death. In 2020, she pleaded guilty to David's murder in Minnesota. She received a second life sentence. She was returned to Minnesota and has since been held at the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Shakopee, where she remains. A 2-part documentary on the case, released on HBO in October 2024, featured Lois Reese giving her first extended interview from prison. The documentary covered her upbringing, her marriage, her gambling addiction, and her account of the night David died. She maintained that his death began with an argument that he escalated by putting a loaded gun in her hands. She did not contest that she had pulled the trigger, or that she had then driven south and killed a stranger on a beach in Florida. Her 5 grandchildren, the ones she had spoiled with gifts, were growing up without her. Pamela Hutchinson's friends and family were doing the same without Pamela. In Blooming Prairie, where Lois had been one of those familiar faces at the bowling alley and the diner, people had found out the truth in the worst possible way. Not through anything she said, but through a welfare check that turned up a body she had covered with a blanket and walked away from on a cold March night. She had then driven to a casino and played the slots. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From the flatlands of Minnesota, we move across the Atlantic to a small town in North Wales, where a 2-year-old boy named Ethan arrived at his grandparents' home in June 2021. He would be dead within 7 weeks. What the CCTV cameras inside that house recorded is what eventually put his grandmother away for life. Case 4. Kerry Ives. When a social worker arrived at a house on Kingsley Road in Garden City, D-side, on the morning of August 4, 2021, she was turned away at the door. The household was isolating, she was told. COVID. The child was asleep. The visit was recorded as a non-contact, and a return appointment was booked. That child was 2-year-old Ethan Ives Griffiths, who had been placed on the Child Protection Register 17 days earlier. He was registered precisely because authorities had identified him as vulnerable, precisely so that he would be seen and checked on by people whose job it was to keep him safe. He was not seen. 9 days after the social worker was turned away at that door, Ethan collapsed on the living room floor with a catastrophic head injury. He died 2 days later. He had been living in that house on Kingsley Road for roughly 7 weeks. Ethan came from a difficult background, but before the summer of 2021, he had been developing normally. A health visitor who assessed him in June 2021 recorded no concerns. He could run, throw a ball, avoid obstacles, and use around 50 words. He played alongside other children and showed what the health visitor described as an age-appropriate rebelliousness, the stubbornness of a toddler who is healthy and present and very much his own small person. There was nothing in that record to suggest what was coming. There was no note of alarm. His mother was Shannon Ives, 28 years old, who had been raising Ethan largely on her own. She was not managing well. Shannon had failed to register Ethan with a GP. She had received written warnings from social services requesting she make contact. She had conversations with a health visitor in early June, in which she raised concerns about the behavior of Ethan's father toward her, and those conversations triggered a formal process. On July 19, 2021, Ethan was placed on the Child Protection Register. That registration came with specific requirements. He was to be seen by his lead professional at least once every 10 days, and a home visit was to take place at least once every 4 weeks. Shannon cancelled multiple appointments in the weeks that followed. She did not facilitate the monitoring that the system had designed to protect her son. In late June 2021, Ethan moved to live with Shannon's parents at their home on Kingsley Road in Garden City, a small residential settlement in Flintshire, North Wales. His grandparents were Michael Ives, 47 years old, and Kerry Ives, 46. The couple had originally come from Wolverhampton and had lived in North Wales for some years. They had several adult children, Shannon among them. Shannon would later tell the court that growing up in her parents' household had meant being punched, kicked, and beaten with a belt from the age of 4. She described them as horrible. She also said she had been scared of them in the summer of 2021. The same people who had subjected their own children to violence over years were now the adults responsible for the care and safety of Ethan. Inside that house on Kingsley Road, Michael and Kerry Ives had installed CCTV cameras. They covered the interior of the home and the garden outside. Those cameras, which the couple had placed there themselves, would become the most decisive evidence in the prosecution's case against them. From the beginning of his time in the house, Ethan was singled out. Investigators who spent months reviewing hundreds of hours of footage from the cameras documented a sustained and deliberate pattern. Ethan was denied food. He was denied water. He was struck repeatedly by adults. Other children in the household were encouraged to treat his mistreatment as play, joining in rather than being protected from it. On August 4, 2021, footage from the garden showed Ethan on a trampoline, struggling to keep his balance while other children bounced around him. One of those children was significantly older and larger, bouncing hard while Ethan flopped and stumbled. At one point, Shannon climbed onto the trampoline herself and bounced, causing Ethan to fall. All three adults present, Michael, Kerry, and Shannon, were in the garden. None of them intervened. Kerry and Shannon stood by and watched. Michael Ives had sent text messages during this period that investigators later recovered. In those messages, he wrote that Ethan would have to learn the hard way. The judge who presided over the sentencing described what had happened inside that house as a campaign, a deliberate and sustained effort to break the spirit of a 2-year-old child. Kerry Ives was captured on CCTV hitting Ethan herself, not merely standing by. She was also, the judge found in his sentencing remarks, actively encouraging Michael during the worst of the violence. Ethan was not seen on any CCTV footage capturing movement in or out of the house for nearly a week, between August 4th and August 12th. The prosecution offered the inference that this was deliberate, that by that point his condition had deteriorated so severely that those in the house were keeping him inside and out of view. Kerry Ives herself described Ethan when he first arrived as chubby and bubbly, a child who was visibly healthy. By August, the nursing staff at the hospital who would eventually treat him would describe a child they had never seen presented in such a state, painfully thin, a potbelly of the kind seen in severely malnourished children, cracked and dry lips, blank and unresponsive. On the morning of August 13, 2021, the day before Ethan's final collapse, he lost consciousness in the living room. He had been in the room with Michael Ives. Shannon was upstairs when Michael called up to her. "Come down quick, it's Ethan." She came downstairs and found the boy lying on the floor, eyes rolling back, gasping. He was unresponsive for approximately 5 minutes. Shannon and Michael worked to bring him round. He regained consciousness. He was not taken to a hospital. He was not taken to a GP. He was not examined by anyone with medical training. He was taken to Tesco. Michael and Kerry Ives drove him to the supermarket that afternoon. A medical expert later gave evidence at trial that this decision was incomprehensible, that it was callous, and that it represented a gross dereliction of responsibility toward a child who had lost consciousness without any apparent cause. Kerry Ives was in her bedroom when the August 13 collapse happened, she claimed. She said she was told about it afterward and was reassured by Michael and Shannon that Ethan had recovered. She told the court that had she been awake and present, she would have suggested calling an ambulance. She did not explain why, once she knew that her 2-year-old grandson had been unconscious for 5 minutes and received no medical attention. She did not take him to a doctor herself. At around 9 in the evening on August 14, 2021, Ethan collapsed again in the living room. This time he did not regain consciousness. Shannon was upstairs on the phone to a friend. Michael and Kerry Ives were downstairs with Ethan. Medical evidence presented at trial concluded that the injury Ethan suffered that evening was catastrophic and non-survivable, caused by deliberate force that may have included forceful shaking. The judge, in his sentencing remarks delivered at Mould Crown Court in October 2025, was direct about what the evidence showed. On that final Saturday evening, Michael had assaulted Ethan more violently than he had on any previous occasion, and Kerry was encouraging him. Within minutes of that assault, Ethan collapsed. Kerry Ives did not call 999 immediately. She first made a FaceTime call to one of her daughters. It was not until 9:21 in the evening, 18 minutes after Ethan collapsed, that an ambulance was called. When she spoke to the emergency service, she said her grandson had collapsed while watching television. Paramedics who arrived at the scene and began assessing Ethan later told the court that he looked like a 90-year-old man. His lips were cracked and dry. He was severely dehydrated. He was dangerously underweight. He had 40 visible bruises and injury marks across his small body. Those injuries included bruising to his face, abdominal injuries consistent with forceful blows, abrasions along his spine, a cut to his bottom lip, a torn frenulum, a chipped tooth, and evidence of an older bleed on the brain, predating the injuries of that final evening. Ethan was taken by ambulance and transferred to Alder Hay Children's Hospital in Liverpool, one of the country's leading specialist centres for children. Medical staff there found a brain so severely swollen that experts described him as essentially experiencing a stroke across an entire half of his brain. They did everything they could. Ethan Ives Griffiths died on August 16, 2021. He was 2 years and 3 months old. In the immediate aftermath of his collapse, Michael and Kerry Ives entered what the prosecution later described at trial as a pact of silence. Prosecutors argued the 18-minute delay before calling 999 was used to coordinate their account, to align their stories, to decide what they were going to say had happened. What they told police, consistently, was that nothing had happened to Ethan before he collapsed. They said they had been watching television. They said they did not know why he fell. The CCTV footage from their own cameras said otherwise. The investigation that followed was led by the North Wales Police Major Investigation Team. Detectives spent months gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, consulting medical experts, and reviewing the footage from the cameras that Michael and Kerry Ives had installed in the house where they killed their grandson. The volume of footage was significant. The content of it was, by every account of those who reviewed it, deeply disturbing. Michael and Kerry were charged with murder. Shannon was charged with causing or allowing the death of a child. All three pleaded not guilty. During the proceedings, Michael and Kerry both tried to redirect responsibility toward Shannon. Michael gave a police interview in which he described seeing Shannon strike Ethan on multiple occasions. Kerry gave evidence in which she too blamed her daughter, saying she had told Shannon not to hit Ethan, and Shannon had told her to mind her business. Shannon, for her part, told investigators she would never hurt her child, and that when Ethan's final collapse happened, her parents were the only 2 people downstairs with him. She also admitted, in a separate interview, that she had taken no steps to protect her son from her parents because she was scared of them. The trial ran for 6 weeks at Mould Crown Court. The jury, 7 women and 5 men, were shown the CCTV footage. They heard from medical experts about Ethan's injuries and the forces required to cause them. They heard from the nursing staff who had received him at hospital and had described him as a child who had not been looked after. They were told about the August 13 collapse and the decision to take Ethan shopping afterward. They were told about the social worker who had been turned away at the door on August 5, and the cancelled appointments before that. They were told about the pact. They heard the calls where Kerry told the ambulance service that Ethan had been watching television. Deliberations lasted 6 hours and 54 minutes. On July 15, 2025, the jury returned unanimous verdicts. Michael Ives was found guilty of murder and of child cruelty. Kerry Ives was found guilty of murder and of child cruelty. Shannon Ives was found guilty of causing or allowing the death of a child and of child cruelty. Judge Mr. Justice Griffiths presided over the sentencing on October 3, 2025. Before he handed down the sentences, he described Ethan. He said Ethan had been a 2-year-old with an independent spirit, brave and resilient. A boy with a strong character who, when he was hit, had sometimes laughed in response, defiant even then. He said the people around Ethan had not liked this quality in him. They had decided to break him. They had beaten him and starved him and withheld fluids from him and denied him the attention of anyone outside the household who might have seen what was happening and stopped it. The judge said all the hopes and promise of the life Ethan should have had were taken from him. Michael Ives was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 23 years before he could be considered for parole. Kerry Ives received life with a minimum term of 17 years. Shannon Ives was sentenced to 12 years. Ethan's father, Will Griffiths, had not been in the house. He had not known what was happening inside it. He read a statement to the court. He said he could finally begin to grieve now that the people responsible were being held to account. He said what happened to Ethan had changed everything in his life. He said he would never see his son's first day of school, or watch him grow up, or know who he would have become. He described Ethan as smiley and outgoing. The judge exempted the jury from further jury service for life if they wished. He said the subject matter of the trial had been unusually distressing. A note in the sentencing remarks acknowledged that Shannon Ives, as well as Kerry Ives, were assessed as having exceptionally low intelligence. It did not excuse what any of them had done. The boy had been placed on the child protection register. The social worker had gone to the door. Nobody had let her in. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From North Wales, we move back across the Atlantic to the American South of the 1920s, where a woman named Nanny Doss was reading romance magazines and dreaming of the perfect marriage. She would marry 5 times. All 5 husbands would die, and it would be decades before anyone thought to count the bodies. Case 5. Janie Lou Gibbs, January 21st, 1966. A doctor in Cordelli, Georgia, completed a death certificate for a 39-year-old man named Charles Clayton Gibbs. The cause of death recorded on that document was liver disease, undiagnosed, until it became fatal. Charles had been ill for some weeks before the end, his symptoms including the kind of gastrointestinal distress and progressive weakness that, in the medical understanding of the time, and the diagnostic tools available to a small city physician in central Georgia, looked like what the certificate said it was. There was no reason, as far as anyone could determine, to look harder. A man in his late 30s with no prior known illness had died from what turned out to be an undetected condition. It was sad. It was not unusual enough to generate questions. Charles left behind a wife and 3 sons, and a community that knew all of them well. Cordell sat in the heart of Crisp County in central Georgia, a modest city shaped by agriculture, modest industry, and the rhythms of southern small-town life in the middle of the 20th century. Church membership there was not simply a matter of private faith. It was a social structure, a network of mutual obligation, a system through which people in difficulty were recognized and supported and cared for. Janie Lou Gibbs was embedded in that structure at every level. She had been born Janie Lou Hickox in Cordell on Christmas Day 1932 and had lived her entire life within the community she had grown up in. She ran a daycare from her home, caring for the children of working families in the neighborhood. She taught Sunday school. She sat on committees. She was soft-spoken and bespectacled, the kind of person who filled the roles that held a congregation together, and she had filled them reliably for years. She and Charles had been married for 18 years and had 3 sons, Marvin, Melvin, and Roger. When Charles died in January 1966, the church around Janie Lou responded with the warmth and solidarity that communities like Cordelli reserved for people they trusted and loved. Meals were brought, time was given, support came from every direction. The response was, by accounts of people who were there, overwhelming in its generosity. Janie Lou accepted it with the composure and quiet faith that everyone who knew her would have expected. And when she received the life insurance money from her husband's death, she took a portion of it, roughly 10%, and gave it to the church. The congregation remembered that gesture for years afterward as an act of genuine piety. What nobody in that congregation knew was that Janie Lou Gibbs had been putting arsenic into Charles's food before his death. She had continued to do so when he was hospitalized, bringing him homemade soup that contained more of the same substance. She had purchased the arsenic from a local hardware store, presenting the purchase as a practical matter of pest control in the home. In the mid-1960s, arsenic-based rat poison was sold without restriction, without documentation, without any mechanism that would allow an observer to connect a buyer to a victim months later. It was a common household product. Nobody remarked on the purchase. Arsenic is a poison with a particular quality that has made it useful for exactly the kind of killing Janie Lou Gibbs was engaged in. In small doses administered over time, it produces symptoms that have historically been mistaken for gastrointestinal illness, liver conditions, neurological problems, and a range of other natural causes. The body absorbs it slowly. The deterioration is gradual. A person poisoned with arsenic does not, in most cases, collapse suddenly or present in a way that immediately suggests foul play. They become progressively sicker, they lose weight, they suffer abdominal pain and vomiting and weakness, and they eventually die in a manner that looks, to a physician without specific reason for suspicion, entirely consistent with disease. That is precisely what happened to Charles Clayton Gibbs. His death certificate said liver disease. The church brought food and comfort to his widow, and Janie Lou collected the insurance. 8 months after Charles died, her youngest son Marvin became ill. He was 13 years old. His symptoms followed the same pattern his father's had: stomach trouble, weakness, deterioration over weeks. He died on August 29, 1966. The death certificate attributed his death to hepatitis. Doctors considered the family history, noted that the father had died of what was described as a liver condition, and concluded that Marvin had inherited some predisposition to the same kind of illness. It was a plausible enough story. It was the story the evidence seemed to tell. Janie Lou received insurance money for Marvin's death as well, and again donated a substantial portion of it to the church. The community again offered its condolences. A mother who had lost a husband and then a young son in the space of 8 months was seen as someone bearing an unusually heavy burden with remarkable faith and grace. The second son, Melvin, was 16 years old when he died on January 23, 1967. His death came 5 months after Marvin's. 3 deaths in the same household in under 2 years, a husband and 2 of his sons, in descending order of age, each attributed by physicians to a different natural cause. Melvin's death certificate listed a rare muscular disorder. The community was stunned, again, by what seemed like a series of terrible misfortunes striking a family that had done nothing to deserve them. Janie Lou again received insurance money. She again tithed a portion of it to the congregation. She was, as far as anyone around her could see, a woman of deep faith absorbing loss after loss with quiet dignity. By the end of January 1967, Janie Lou Gibbs had collected approximately $31,000 across the deaths of her husband and 2 younger sons. She had donated $3,100 of that to her church. Her eldest son Roger was still alive. He was 19 years old, recently married, and in 1967, his wife gave birth to a baby boy. The infant's name was Ronnie. When Roger came home with news of the baby, Janie Lou became a grandmother for the first time. People who knew her at the time said she appeared to take real pleasure in it, that the baby's arrival seemed to give her something to hold on to after the losses of the previous 2 years. She doted on Ronnie. Within months of his birth, Ronnie became ill. He was an infant, and infants have no established predisposition to liver disease or rare muscular disorders. No family medical history that a doctor could point to as an explanation, but he sickened nonetheless, and he died. Around a month later, Roger himself became ill and died. He was 19 years old. A healthy young man and his healthy newborn son, dead within weeks of each other, with no apparent connection between the causes. Roger's wife, Ronnie's mother, asked for an investigation. The attending physician, by this point confronted with a pattern that no single diagnosis could explain, referred the case to the state crime laboratory. An autopsy was performed on Roger. The results came back with a finding that could not be attributed to inherited illness or misfortune, a fatal concentration of arsenic in his system. Ronnie was exhumed and tested. The results were the same. Investigators moved to the other bodies. They exhumed Charles. They exhumed Marvin. They exhumed Melvin. Each of the 5 exhumed remains showed arsenic. The poison was the same substance in every case. The death certificates with their various attributed causes, liver disease, hepatitis, rare muscular disorder, were all wrong. Every one of them. 5 people who had all lived in the same house, all cooked for by the same woman, had all died of the same thing. Local physicians who had treated surviving members of the Gibbs household also noted, during the investigation, that some of those survivors had presented over the preceding months with symptoms consistent with arsenic exposure: persistent vomiting, abdominal pain, neurological issues. The question of how many people Janie Lou may have poisoned who did not die was not fully resolved. Janie Lou Gibbs was arrested on December 23, 1967, in Cordell. Investigators confronted her with the toxicology results. She denied any involvement. She maintained her innocence through the 23rd and into the 24th, as Christmas Eve arrived and the case against her mounted. On December 25, 1967, which was both Christmas Day and her 35th birthday, she was advised of her rights, and she signed a 14-page written confession. In that document, she admitted to mixing arsenic into the food and drinks of her husband and all 3 sons, and of her infant grandson Ronnie. She stated in the confession that she had loved all of them. She stated that she could not explain why she had done what she had done. She had never, in the confession or in any subsequent statement, provided a coherent account of her reasoning. The financial motive was undeniable. She had collected life insurance payments after each death, had purchased the policies, had kept them current, and had received and spent the proceeds. Investigators concluded that money was the driver, but the full psychological picture of a woman who could poison a 13-year-old boy, watch him die over weeks, attend his funeral, accept condolences, donate to the church, and then begin poisoning her next son was never cleanly resolved. She said she loved them. She offered nothing beyond that. What followed her arrest was not a swift path to trial. A court convened to assess her mental fitness and found her incompetent to participate in her own defense. She was committed to a state mental institution where she was assigned to work in the kitchen. She cooked. She worked without apparent incident in that institutional kitchen for years. Eventually, she was reassessed and found competent to stand trial. Her case finally came to court in April 1976 in the Crisp County Superior Court in Cordell, the same city where she had taught Sunday school and brought poisoned soup to her dying husband in his hospital bed. 9 years had passed since her arrest. She entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. The defense argued that whatever had driven her actions put her outside the range of criminal responsibility. The jury rejected that argument on May 9, 1976. Janie Lou Gibbs was convicted on 5 counts of murder, 1 for Charles, 1 for Marvin, 1 for Melvin, 1 for Roger, 1 for infant Ronnie. The judge sentenced her to 5 consecutive life terms, 1 for each person she had killed. She went to the Georgia Women's Correctional Facility in Hardwick. Records from that institution and from subsequent assessments by parole boards described her consistently as a model prisoner. She followed the rules, caused no problems, maintained a cooperative demeanor, and presented in every observable way as someone who had reformed or at least accommodated herself to institutional life. She applied for parole. The board denied her. She applied again. Denied again. The nature of the crimes, the deliberate poisoning of 5 members of her own family, including an infant, was not something the board was prepared to overlook, regardless of how she conducted herself in confinement. The child she had killed was a baby. Her youngest son had been 13, her middle son 16, her eldest son 19, her husband had been 39, and she had visited him in the hospital to ensure the poison continued to work. In 1999, she was diagnosed with advanced Parkinson's disease. The state of Georgia authorized a medical parole. She was 66 years old. She was released into the custody of her sister and went to live in her sister's care. She did not return to Cordell. For 11 years after her release, she lived quietly, away from the community she had spent her adult life at the center of. She died on February 7, 2010, at a nursing home in Douglasville, Georgia. She was 77 years old. She had never explained herself beyond the 14 pages she signed on Christmas morning in 1967, in which she said she had loved the people she put arsenic into the food of, and could not account for why she had done it. Those 2 things, the love she claimed and the methodical administration of a slow-acting poison to 5 family members across 2 years, including the infant son of her own eldest child, were never made to fit together in any statement she gave or any testimony she offered in the years between her arrest and her death. The insurance policies had been purchased before the deaths began. The hardware store had sold the rat poison across the counter. The church had received the tithed donations with gratitude, and the physicians who signed the death certificates in Cordell in 1966 and 1967 had written down what the evidence in front of them seemed to say, which was not what had actually happened. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From the churches and insurance offices of Central Georgia, we travel back even further in American history, to the rural South of the 1920s, where a woman named Nanny Doss was reading romance magazines and dreaming of the perfect husband. She would find 5 of them. All 5 would die, and it would be 3 decades before anyone thought to ask the right questions about why. Case 6. Nanny Doss. For most of her adult life, Nanny Doss kept a stack of romance magazines somewhere in her home. They were the kind of publications that filled the mid-20th century American market for stories about love that arrived unexpectedly and held firm against hardship, about couples who found each other and built lives of warmth and meaning and permanence. Nanny read them with the kind of devotion other people brought to scripture. She believed, genuinely and entirely, in what they described. She had believed in it since she was a girl in rural Alabama, when the magazines were one of the few things her father had not managed to take away from her, and she would go on believing in it for the rest of her life, through 5 marriages, across 4 states, and across the bodies of 11 people she put arsenic into the food of, across nearly 3 decades. She was born Nancy Agnes Hazel on November 4, 1905, in Blue Mountain, Alabama, in Calhoun County, in a part of the rural South where poor farming families worked land they did not own and sent their children to the fields rather than the schoolhouse. Her father, James Hazel, ran the household with a controlling and sometimes violent hand. He kept his 5 children, daughters and 1 son, out of school and put them to work. He forbade the girls from wearing makeup or fashionable clothes. He did not allow them to attend social events or mix freely with other young people. Whatever the world outside the family farm offered in the way of youth and freedom and ordinary experience, James Hazel's children were kept from most of it. Nanny's escape was the romance magazines, which circulated widely and cheaply in those years, and which offered a world of possibility that her daily life completely foreclosed. She read about couples who met by chance and chose each other freely and lived in households governed by something warmer than her father's rules. When she was around 7 years old, she was riding on a train with her family when the train stopped suddenly and she was thrown forward, her head striking a metal bar. The impact caused severe headaches that came and went for years afterward. She later attributed some of her difficulties to that injury, to whatever it had changed in her. Whether or not that was true in any medical sense was never established. What was established was that she grew up in a house she wanted to leave, reading stories about a life she had decided to find. At 16, she found the first version of it. She met Charlie Braggs at the Linen Thread Company in Anniston, Alabama, where she had gone to work. Her father approved of Braggs, and the courtship moved quickly. They were married within a few months of meeting. They moved in with Braggs's mother, whose personality, by Nanny's later account, matched her own father's in its inflexibility and dominance. Whatever freedom Nanny had imagined marriage would bring, the mother-in-law installed in the household closed it off. She and Charlie had 4 daughters over the years of the marriage: Melvina, a younger pair of girls in the middle, and then Florine, born in 1927. The marriage, beneath its surface, was under considerable strain. Charlie drank and was unfaithful. In 1927, the 2 middle daughters died within months of each other. The deaths were attributed at the time to food poisoning. Charlie Braggs came home one day and found the children on the floor. Whatever he saw or concluded, he was frightened enough to take the oldest girl, Melvina, and leave. He did not return. The couple divorced in 1928. Charlie Braggs was the only man Nanny Doss would ever marry who survived the experience. He was also the one who, by later accounts of those who knew the story, described himself as having been afraid of her. Nanny returned with Florine to her parents' home and found work at a cotton mill. She kept reading the romance columns in the magazines. In 1929, she found her second husband through one of them, Robert Franklin Harrelson of Jacksonville, Alabama, who had placed a notice in a Lonely Hearts newspaper column and who wooed her through correspondence. She responded with letters and a photograph, and they married. Harrelson was an alcoholic with a violent temper and a criminal record, none of which became apparent until the marriage was already settled. He drank, he was unpredictable, and whatever vision of domestic warmth Nanny had constructed from her magazines did not materialize in the Jacksonville household. The marriage lasted 16 years, from 1929 to 1945. During those years, Nanny's older daughter Melvina, by then back in her mother's orbit, had 2 children. The first, a boy named Robert, was born in 1943. In 1945, Melvina had a second infant. During a visit from Nanny, shortly after the second child's birth, the baby died. Melvina later told people she believed she had seen her mother press something sharp into the infant's head while holding the baby, though the cause of death at the time was not determined. The first grandson, Robert, died not long after, also while in Nanny's care. Doctors could not establish the cause of either death. On September 16, 1945, Harrelson came home late and drunk and assaulted Nanny. That night, she put rat poison into his whiskey. He died in considerable pain. The community accepted the death as what it appeared to be, an unwell alcoholic man who had finally succumbed to the damage his drinking had done to his body. No autopsy was performed. Nanny was a widow, she had an insurance payout, and she was free to look for husband number 3. She found him through another Lonely Hearts column, this time in North Carolina. Arlie Jackson Lanning placed an advertisement, Nanny responded, and they were married 3 days after their first meeting. He too turned out to be an alcoholic and a womanizer. The marriage occupied the late 1940s and early 1950s, and during much of it, Nanny disappeared for months at a time, visiting her own family and traveling while Lanning drank and lived as he pleased. At some point in this period, Nanny visited her sister Dovie, who was bedridden with illness. Shortly after the visit, Dovie died. Lanning himself died in February 1952, his death attributed to heart failure. He had been a heavy drinker, and there was influenza moving through the area at the time of his death, and the doctor who examined him found nothing that required him to look further. After the funeral, the house they had shared, which had been willed to Lanning's sister rather than to Nanny, burned down. Nanny collected the insurance on the property. Before leaving North Carolina, Nanny was also caring for Lanning's mother, an elderly woman who had been dealing with a broken hip. The woman died in her sleep during this period. Nanny moved on. Through another Lonely Hearts advertisement, this time in 1952, She found Richard Lewis Morton in Emporia, Kansas, and married him. Morton had his own pattern of infidelity. He spent much of the marriage, by Nanny's account, in the company of other women. Not long after the marriage, Nanny's mother Louisa came to live with the couple. Louisa died in January 1953. In 1953, Morton died as well. Nanny had taken out 5 life insurance policies on him during the marriage, together worth around $1,400. She packed up and began looking again. Samuel Luther Doss was 58 years old when he and Nanny married in Tulsa, Oklahoma, on July 13, 1954. He was, by all accounts, a man of deep religious conviction, organized habits, and firm principles about how a household should function. He attended church faithfully. He had specific views on appropriate reading material and on the amount of time a wife should spend watching television or reading magazines. He did not approve of the romance publications that Nanny had been reading since she was a girl in Alabama, and he told her so. He restricted her access to them. He was, in the account Nanny gave to investigators, the most controlling of all 5 husbands in terms of the rules he imposed on her daily life. 3 months after the wedding, in September 1954, Samuel fell ill with what presented as a severe digestive tract infection. He was admitted to the hospital in Tulsa, treated, and kept for observation. His symptoms improved enough that he was released on October 5. He came home. On October 12, 1954, Samuel Luther Doss died. The 2 life insurance policies Nanny had taken out on him were now payable to her. His doctor was not satisfied. The sequence of events, a man treated and released from the hospital, who then died within a week of going home, required an explanation that the doctor did not yet have. He ordered an autopsy. The results came back showing arsenic in Samuel Doss's system at a concentration that investigators and medical staff later described as massive, far beyond any accidental exposure, enough by one account to have killed many times over. The doctor contacted the authorities. Nanny Doss was arrested on November 1, 1954. She was brought in for questioning by Tulsa police. Over the first hours of interrogation, she denied any involvement in Samuel's death. And then something happened in those interview rooms that nobody present seems to have been fully prepared for. Nanny began to smile. She smiled and giggled while being questioned about the death of her husband. She smiled when investigators described the toxicology results. She smiled when asked about the other husbands. The detectives questioning her were, by later accounts, genuinely unsettled by her manner, which bore no relationship to what the conversation was about. The expression she wore was the expression of someone having a pleasant afternoon. It was this behavior, observed across multiple sessions of questioning and repeated in the courtroom, that gave her the nickname the press attached to her and which stayed the giggling granny. She confessed to killing her sister Dovie and to the deaths of her grandchildren and of Arlie Lanning's mother. In her account, spread across multiple sessions with investigators, she detailed the methods: arsenic, added to food or drink, administered to people who had every reason to trust her and no reason to suspect the food she brought them. She maintained throughout, even as she made these admissions, that she had loved all of them. She told investigators that money was not really the point, that what she had been looking for across all of it was the real romance of life, the perfect marriage, the kind she had read about in the magazines since she was a girl in Alabama. She would also later say, depending on which interview and which account, that she had not harmed her blood relatives, the children and grandchildren, that those deaths had been something other than what the police believed. What investigators concluded, and what the physical evidence showed, were different from what she was willing to accept about herself. The children had died in her care. The grandchildren had died in her care. Arsenic was present in the bodies that were exhumed. The state of Oklahoma built its case around Samuel Doss, and only around Samuel Doss. The prosecuting attorney was J. Howard Edmondson, who would later become governor of Oklahoma. Nanny pleaded guilty to the murder of Samuel Doss on May 17, 1955. She was sentenced to life in prison. The judge presiding over the case declined to pursue the death sentence, noting his reluctance to establish the precedent of executing a woman and raising questions about her mental state. Nanny, according to contemporary accounts of the moment the sentence was read, appeared pleased with the outcome. Before her arrest, she had been corresponding with a dairy farmer in North Carolina named John Keel, exchanging letters and apparently laying the groundwork for a 6th marriage. She had sent him a cake through the post. Law enforcement noted this detail in the course of the investigation. After 2 years in prison, Nanny reportedly told people she would have preferred the death sentence to the life term she had received. She was held at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. She lived out the remainder of her years there. In June 1965, she became ill with leukemia. She died on June 2, 1965, at the age of 59, in the hospital ward of the prison. She was buried at Oak Hill Memorial Park. She had killed 11 people across 27 years, in 4 states, across 5 marriages, and she had done it without a single autopsy being ordered on any of her victims until Samuel Doss died 7 days after his hospital discharge, and his physician decided to look harder. Every one of the deaths before Samuel's had been attributed to something natural, something plausible, something that the circumstances and the woman standing next to the body made the doctors around her want to believe. She had been looking for the perfect mate. She had not found him. She had, however, found the romance magazines, and she had kept reading them in Alabama farmhouses and North Carolina rentals and Kansas newlywed homes and Tulsa living rooms, all the way up to the point when a husband whose deepest offense against her was restricting her access to those same magazines found himself on the wrong side of her cooking. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From rural Oklahoma, we travel back to the American Midwest of the 1930s, to the city of Cincinnati, Ohio, where a young German immigrant had set herself up in a particular kind of business. She would move in with elderly men, take care of their needs, work her way into their wills, and then ensure she did not have to wait long to collect. By the time anyone counted what she had done, 5 men were dead and she was out of options. Case 7. Anna Marie Hahn. George Gesellman had been telling his friends for months that his luck had finally changed. He was 67 years old, a Hungarian-born immigrant who had spent his years in Cincinnati in the kind of modest poverty that left little room for company or comfort. He lived alone. He had almost no money. He was, by the account of a Cincinnati newspaper that would later cover his death, a pathetic and lonely old man who kept to himself and made do. But in the summer of 1937, he had met a woman, a German woman who had offered to look after him, and he had been telling anyone who would listen that she was a German schoolteacher, that she was kind to him, and that he believed things might finally be looking up. On July 6, 1937, neighbors found Gesellman dead in his rooms. There was a half-eaten meal still on the stove. In the pot, investigators would later determine there were 18 grains of arsenic. The woman he had been telling people about was Anna Marie Hahn, and by the time George Gesellman died, she had already killed at least 3 other men in the same city, in the same way, and had pocketed their savings and their wills and their houses, while their communities mourned them as people who had simply lived long enough to go. Anna Marie Hahn was born on July 7, 1906, in Füssen, a small town in Bavaria in southern Germany, set against the edge of the Alps. She was the youngest of 12 children born to George and Katie Filser. Some of those siblings had died before Anna was born, which was not unusual for a large family in early 20th century Bavaria. Her father ran a furniture manufacturing business, and the family lived comfortably. Whatever difficulties came to Anna in later life, deprivation in childhood was not among them. By her own later account, she was a girl who was used to getting things she wanted, and who found ways around rules when they stood in her way. As a teenager, she became pregnant. She told her family that the father was a Viennese physician, a cancer researcher she had become involved with, though investigators who later tried to verify this account found no record of the man she described by the name she gave them. The physician, if he existed at all in the form she described, was never located. What was real was the baby, a son she named Oscar, born around 1925 when Anna was about 19. Her family, embarrassed and at a loss for what to do with her, made arrangements. In 1929, Anna Marie sailed to America and presented herself to relatives, Max and Anna Doschel, who lived in Cincinnati, Ohio. Oscar stayed behind in Bavaria with her parents. Cincinnati was, in those years, a city with a substantial German immigrant population, concentrated in a neighborhood called Over the Rhine, which had built and maintained an identity shaped by German language, German customs, German churches, and German social clubs. It was, for someone like Anna Marie who had arrived alone and without money, a natural place to settle. People spoke her language. People understood where she came from. She could present herself within that community as one of them, which she was, and as a capable and friendly young woman, which she appeared to be. Within a year of her arrival, she had met and married Philipp Hahn, a fellow German immigrant who worked as a telegrapher. She returned briefly to Bavaria to bring Oscar back, and the 3 of them set up what looked from the outside like an ordinary family life in Cincinnati. Philip and Anna ran two bakeries together in the German district of the city. The businesses did reasonably well, but Anna grew restless with the long hours and what the work actually paid. She wanted more money. The bakery was not the way to it. Around this time, her gambling had become a serious problem. She was betting in ways that generated debts she could not cover through honest work, and those debts kept accumulating. At some point during the marriage, she twice attempted to take out life insurance policies on Philip, each for $25,000, and was refused both times. Not long after the second refusal, Philip fell seriously ill at home. His mother, alarmed by his condition and by the unusual fact that Anna was arguing against taking him to the hospital, had him brought in for medical treatment over Anna's objections. Philip survived. Whatever had made him sick, and no cause was ever formally established, it resolved under hospital care. His marriage to Anna did not survive much longer than his illness. By 1932, Anna had left the bakery and developed a new plan. She presented herself to elderly men in the German immigrant community of Cincinnati as a caregiver, a kindly, capable woman who could cook and clean and look after the household needs of men who were living alone and aging without family. She had no training or experience as a caregiver. She had a considerable talent for presenting herself as someone people could trust. Her first client was a man named Ernst Koch, who was in his 70s and had no living relatives. He died on May 6, 1933, not long after Anna began caring for him. He had put her in his will. He left her a house. The death was attributed to natural causes. A man of his age, alone, dying without close family to ask questions, was not a situation that generated investigations. Her next client was Albert Parker, 72 years old. He died as well. Before his death, Anna had signed a document acknowledging that she had borrowed $1,000 from him, money she agreed to repay. After his death, the document was not found among his papers. The money was not found either. The pattern might have continued undetected for considerably longer if Anna had not decided, in the summer of 1937, to take things further and move faster. In the space of a few months, she went through two more men in Cincinnati, and then made a catastrophic decision to take a third on a trip out of state. Jacob Wagner was 78 years old. He was a solitary man who had no living relatives and who knew it. Anna approached him, presenting herself as a long-lost niece. He was aware he had no living nieces, but he was lonely and she was attentive, and he allowed the relationship to develop. He changed his will to leave $17,000 in cash to his beloved niece Anna. He died on June 3, 1937. The will was executed. Within days, she had found George Gesellman, who told his friends about the German schoolteacher he was sure he would marry. He died on July 6, 1937, 18 grains of arsenic in the pot on his stove. She received $15,000 from Gesellman's estate. 4 weeks later, Anna Marie Hahn boarded a train from Cincinnati to Colorado Springs. She had her son Oscar with her. She also had Georg Obendorfer, 67 years old, a retired shoemaker. Obendorfer began feeling ill on the train itself. By the time they reached Colorado, he needed medical attention. He was admitted to the Memorial Hospital in Colorado Springs. He died on August 1, 1937. At his bedside, as he was dying, Anna Marie Hahn bent over him and inquired of hospital staff what the man's name was, professing she did not know him. Police who later interviewed hospital staff reported that this was the scene they described: a woman standing over a dying man she had traveled across the country with, telling the staff around her that she was unacquainted with him. An autopsy on Obendorfer found high levels of arsenic in his body. Colorado Springs police sent a routine communication to the Cincinnati Police Department, noting that a woman named Anna Hahn was wanted in connection with a theft at the hotel where she had been staying, where $300 worth of diamonds had gone missing. The communication was routine, but it was enough to put Cincinnati Detective Lieutenant George Shattle on the case. Shattle moved quickly. He investigated the death of Obendorfer and found, in examining Anna's recent movements and associations, the trail that led backward through Gesellman, Wagner, Parker, and Koch. Each of them had been an elderly German man in Cincinnati who had come to know Anna Marie Hahn and had died not long after. Each of the deaths had been unquestioned at the time. Each of them, looked at together, formed a pattern that was impossible to explain as coincidence. A search of Anna Hahn's home found what one detective later described to reporters as enough poison to kill half of Cincinnati. Police found arsenic. They found bottles of other substances. They found forged documents tied to her victims' estates. Philip Hahn, by this point separated from Anna, and with no interest in protecting her, produced a bottle of poison he had found in her belongings and turned it over to investigators. 2 of Anna's previous victims were exhumed, their bodies were tested. Arsenic was found in both. Anna Marie Hahn was arrested on August 24, 1937. She was charged with the murder of Jacob Wagner, the case for which the evidence was most complete. The trial began in October 1937. It lasted 4 weeks. The jury that heard the case was composed of 11 women and 1 man, an unusual makeup for the era, and one that would have seemed to favor a female defendant in the eyes of those who assumed women would be more sympathetic to another woman. The evidence did not allow for much sympathy. Oscar, Anna's son, was called to testify. He told the jury about the train journey from Cincinnati to Colorado, about traveling with his mother and Obendorfer, and about Obendorfer becoming ill en route. Organs from 2 of the exhumed victims were presented as evidence. Chemists and medical experts testified about the concentrations of arsenic found in the bodies. Anna's defense maintained her innocence throughout. She testified on her own behalf and presented herself as best she could, which was well. She was described in press coverage of the trial as poised and composed. The newspapers had given her nicknames, the Blonde Borgia, Arsenic Anna, and they came out in force for every day of proceedings. The trial drew full courtrooms and national press attention. In his closing argument, the prosecuting attorney described Anna Marie Hahn in terms that the jury would have had the full evidence of 4 weeks of testimony to weigh against. She was sly, he said, because she had chosen victims with no relatives to ask questions. She was driven by a hunger for money so complete that no act was too low for her if it served the purpose. She had sat through 4 weeks of damaging testimony without showing any emotion. In the 4 corners of the courtroom, he told the jury, stood 4 dead men. On November 6, 1937, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder. Anna Marie Hahn was sentenced to death. She appealed. Every appeal failed. Throughout the period between sentencing and execution, she maintained the belief, shared by many who followed the case, that the state of Ohio would not send a woman to the electric chair. The state of Ohio had, in fact, never executed a woman. She was right about that historical fact. She was wrong about what would follow from it. On December 7, 1938, at the Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus, Anna Marie Hahn was put to death in the electric chair. She was 32 years old. She was the first woman ever to be executed in that manner in the state of Ohio. In the final hours before her execution, she wrote letters to her attorney. Those letters constituted a full confession to her crimes. She described what she had done to the men in her care, and she wrote about her confusion as to why she had done it. And she wrote at length about her fear for her son Oscar, who was 12 years old and now without a mother. The letters were sold after her execution to the Cincinnati Enquirer, under the condition agreed to by all parties that the money from the sale be placed into a trust fund for Oscar. The commitment was honored. Oscar eventually lived with a foster family somewhere in the Midwest. He grew up, served in the United States Navy during the Second World War, and built a life that the public record does not illuminate beyond those few details. Anna Hahn had found those elderly men through the German immigrant community she moved in, through its social clubs and its neighborhoods, through the particular closeness of a transplanted culture where people kept an eye out for one another, and where a friendly woman who offered to help an old man with his cooking and his housekeeping was something that made sense. The men she found were isolated, without family, sometimes impoverished, sometimes not, but all alone in a way that meant nobody would look hard when they died. Ernst Koch left her a house. Albert Parker left her a debt instrument that disappeared. Jacob Wagner left her $17,000 as his beloved niece. George Giselman had told his friends he was going to marry her. The pot on his stove still had 18 grains of arsenic in it when they found him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From the rooming houses of Cincinnati, we moved to a farm in Missouri in the late 1980s, where an elderly couple were running what appeared to be a struggling agricultural operation. What investigators eventually found in the fields around that farm would make it one of the most disturbing cases of domestic murder in American history. Case 8, Faye Copeland. When investigators arrived at a 40-acre farm in Mooresville, Missouri in October 1989, the man who met them at the property's edge was 74 years old. Ray Copeland had already been briefed that they were coming, had already been told they had a warrant. He let them past and told them they would find nothing on his place. He was wrong by 5 bodies. Mooresville sits in Livingston County, in the agricultural plains of northern Missouri, roughly 80 miles north of Kansas City. The Copeland farm was typical of the region: modest, functional, occupying a stretch of flat land given over to raising livestock and growing the kinds of crops that kept a small operation afloat. Ray and Faye Copeland had purchased it in 1966 and had lived there together since, a couple in their 40s and then their 50s and then their 60s, aging into the landscape until they became part of it, unremarkable to the neighbors around them. Ray was known locally as a difficult man, suspicious of strangers and short with those who crossed him. Faye was quieter. She had worked for years at a local glove-making factory. They had raised their children on that land. What investigators found on the property that October, over the course of a 2-week search conducted with dozens of officers and trained bloodhounds, was the evidence of a killing operation that the couple had been running for at least 3 years. 3 bodies were recovered on the farm itself. 2 more were found in or near a barn Ray used on an adjacent property. A 6th set of remains, belonging to a man named Dennis Murphy, was found in a well on another farm in the area. A .22 caliber Marlin bolt-action rifle, recovered from the Copeland home, matched the ballistics connected to the deaths. All of the bodies had been shot in the back of the head. To understand how this had gone undetected, it is necessary to understand something about the people who died on that farm, and about the man who had spent most of his adult life building toward the conditions that made what happened there possible. Ray Copeland was born in Oklahoma in 1914 and grew up in poverty, his family moving constantly through the Depression years, never putting down roots, always looking for the next place that might hold something more than the last one. He dropped out of school at the age of 9 and never learned to read or write with any fluency. What he did develop, across the lean years of his youth, was a facility for a particular kind of fraud, buying livestock with checks he had no intention of honoring, selling the animals before the checks bounced, and moving on before anyone caught up with him. It was not a sophisticated scheme. It was the kind of scheme that worked only as long as he stayed ahead of it, and it did not always work. He was arrested and served a year in jail in 1939 for check fraud related to livestock purchases. He was released in 1940, met Faye Wilson, and married her. They had children. The money was tight with a growing family, and so Ray went back to the livestock fraud, and he was caught again, and he served more time. This happened repeatedly across the years that followed. The family moved from place to place to stay ahead of Ray's reputation. By the time they settled in Mooresville, he was in his early 50s, and the pattern had been set so long it was simply how he lived. Cattle auctions in northern Missouri eventually came to know who he was. His face was recognized. His checks were no longer accepted, which was when he developed the approach that led to the graves. If the auction houses would not deal with Ray Copeland, then someone else would have to do the buying. The solution Ray arrived at was to find men who were unknown to those auction houses, men whose names and faces had never appeared in any fraud ledger, men who could walk up to a livestock sale and write a check and have it accepted without any hesitation. He needed men who were also willing to disappear once the transaction was complete, who would take work where they could find it and then move on without asking too many questions or leaving an address where anyone could reach them. The drifters and transients who passed through rural Missouri in the 1980s were exactly this. Men living without fixed addresses, without families waiting for them to come home, without social networks that would notice when they stopped appearing. Ray approached them at shelters and along roadsides, offering farm work and wages. He told them he had trouble with the auction houses, that the managers there had a personal problem with him and wouldn't give him a fair price. He told them if they would open a post office box and a bank account in their own names and do the buying for him, there was money in it for them. Some of them took the work. Ray would take the drifter to the livestock sale. The drifter would purchase cattle on Ray's instructions, writing checks from the account Ray had helped him set up, checks that had no money behind them. Ray would sell the cattle quickly before the checks cleared. And then, when the scheme was done, Ray would bring the worker back to the farm and shoot him in the back of the head with the Marlin rifle. He did this because the alternative was a witness. Each drifter who wrote a fraudulent check at an auction was someone who could connect the fraud back to Ray. Each one was a loose end. The solution Ray found was to eliminate them, bury them on or near his property, and then find the next man who needed work. 5 men are confirmed dead in this manner between October 1986 and May 1989. Dennis Murphy died in October 1986. His remains eventually recovered from a well. Wayne Warner died in November 1986. Jimmy Dale Harvey, 27 years old, died in October 1988. John Freeman, also 27, and from Tulsa, Oklahoma, died in December 1988. Paul Cowart, 21 years old, from Dardanelle, Arkansas, died in May 1989. Investigators believed the actual number of victims was higher, perhaps as many as 12, based on the list found in the house and the number of men who had passed through the farm and never been seen again. Only 5 sets of remains were recovered. Faye Copeland's name entered the story through 2 pieces of evidence that prosecutors would use against her at trial. The first was a quilt. When investigators searched the farmhouse, they found clothing that did not belong to Ray or Faye. Some of it had belonged to the men who had worked on the farm and died there. Faye had taken that clothing and sewn it into a quilt. She had done this with the work clothes of murdered men. The second piece of evidence was a list. It was handwritten, and the handwriting was Faye's. Ray Copeland was illiterate. He could not have written it. The list contained names, and among those names were the names of men who had come to the farm and died there. Next to the names of Freeman, Cowart, and Harvey, there were large X marks. The list had at least 12 names with X marks in total, corresponding to men investigators believed had worked on the farm. 5 of those men were confirmed dead. The whereabouts of the rest were never established. The investigation had been triggered by a man named Jack McCormick, a transient himself, wanted for passing bad checks. McCormick had worked on the Copeland farm and had, unlike the others, survived the experience. He later described a night when Ray brought him into the barn under the pretext of catching a raccoon, and when McCormick turned around, Ray was standing behind him with a rifle. McCormick managed to talk his way out of it, left Missouri, and told himself he would keep quiet. He did not keep quiet indefinitely. In August 1989, he called the Crime Stoppers hotline and told them about the Copeland farm, about the bones he believed he had seen there, and about Ray pointing a rifle at his head. Police were skeptical. The description McCormick gave was of an elderly farming couple, and the Crime Stoppers tip line was not unused to calls that did not lead anywhere. But they checked Ray Copeland's criminal record, which was extensive, and they decided the investigation was worth pursuing. In October 1989, they arrived at the farm in force. Ray told them they would find nothing. The bloodhounds led them to 3 sets of remains on the farm. 2 more were found on adjacent property. The rifle was recovered. The quilt was recovered. The list was recovered. Ray Copeland was arrested on October 17, 1989. Faye was arrested as well. In the period between their arrest and Faye's trial, the question of what exactly Faye knew, and when she knew it, became the central legal and human puzzle of the case. Ray had a documented history of domestic violence against her. Faye's defense attorneys built their case around the argument that she was herself a victim of her husband, a woman who had endured beatings for decades, and who had lived in too much fear of Ray to question what was happening on the property, or to intervene when men arrived for work and did not leave. They argued she was a bystander, not a participant, shaped by a lifetime of abuse into the kind of compliance that looked, from the outside, like complicity, but was something else entirely. The prosecution's counter to this was the list and the quilt. They argued that a woman who did not know what had happened to the men on that farm would not have kept their clothes after they left, and would not have had their names written down in a record she maintained for her illiterate husband. The quilt, in particular, made the argument in terms that required no legal framework to understand. She had taken dead men's clothes and made herself something warm to sleep under. The jury did not hear the battered woman syndrome evidence. The judge had ruled it inadmissible. The defense had no way to place before the 12 people in that jury box the psychological portrait of a woman, shaped by decades of violence, into compliance with a man she feared. What the jury had was the list and the quilt. Faye Copeland went to trial on November 1, 1990. She was 69 years old. The jury deliberated for 2.5 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on 5 counts of first-degree murder. The penalty phase took another 3 hours. The judge sentenced Faye Copeland to death by lethal injection on 4 of the counts and to life in prison without parole on the 5th. When the sentence was read, Faye Copeland wept without being able to stop herself. Ray went to trial in March 1991. He was 76. He was also convicted on 5 counts and sentenced to death. The sentencing dates made the 2 of them, at 69 and 76 respectively, the oldest couple ever sentenced to death in the United States. That record has not been broken. Ray Copeland died at the Potosi Correctional Center in Missouri on October 19, 1993. He was 78 years old. He died without being executed, before the sentence could be carried out. Faye remained on death row. She became, in time, the oldest woman on death row in American history, a distinction she held until 1999. In August of that year, a federal judge overturned her death sentence. The ruling was based on the failure to allow the battered woman syndrome evidence at trial. The judge found that this had denied Faye a fair hearing on the question of penalty. Her murder convictions were not overturned. She was ordered to remain imprisoned for the rest of her life. She worked in the greenhouse at her prison, by accounts of those who knew her there. Her attorney, arguing for her release, described her as a woman who would not hurt anyone, whose door the warden could open without concern. Women's advocacy groups had campaigned for her release through much of the 1990s, arguing that the system had failed to account adequately for the dynamics of a long and brutal domestic relationship when it sentenced her. In August 2002, Faye suffered a stroke. It left her partially paralyzed and unable to speak. She was 79 years old, Missouri authorized medical parole, and she was released to a nursing home in Chillicothe, Missouri, the nearest substantial town to the farm where she had lived most of her adult life. She died there, at the Morningside Center Nursing Home, on December 23, 2003, at the age of 82. She left behind 5 children and 17 grandchildren. The men she was convicted of helping to kill had left behind whatever they had come from, which in most cases was very little, which was precisely why Ray Copeland had chosen them. They were men nobody would come looking for. They were, by the design of the scheme, supposed to be invisible. The quilt made from their clothes was evidence at trial and is not invisible anymore. It sits in the public record of the case, alongside the list in Faye Copeland's handwriting, with the X marks next to names, and together, those 2 objects have outlasted everyone involved in putting them there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From Missouri, we move to the American South again, but to a story with no tidy ending. Betty Newmer had 5 husbands. All 5 died. She was eventually charged, finally arrested, and brought to the edge of a courtroom. Then she died too, and took everything she knew with her. Case 9. Betty Newmer. For 2 months in the spring and early summer of 1986, a former police officer named Alan Lawrence tried to warn the authorities in Stanley County, North Carolina, that a woman wanted her husband dead. Lawrence had been approached, he said later, and asked if he would do the killing. He had refused. He had then gone to the police. He made the call more than once, pressing them to act on what he was telling them, describing what he knew and urging them to do something before it was too late. Nobody acted on the warning. On July 14, 1986, Harold Gentry was found shot to death inside his home in Norwood, North Carolina. He had been hit by multiple bullets. He was lying face down on the floor of the house he had built on land his sister and her husband had given the couple. The home appeared to have been ransacked, and police initially theorized that Harold had come home and walked in on a robbery in progress. His wife was not there when the body was found. Harold Gentry had served 21 years in the United States Army, moving his family from base to base over those decades before retiring and deciding to come back to the North Carolina town where he had grown up. People there knew him as someone with no enemies, a steady and quiet man who had served his country and come home to build something lasting. In the weeks before he died, he had told his brother Al that something was not right in his marriage. He said the woman he was married to was not who she presented herself to be, that Al should never trust her. Al Gentry spent the next 22 years trying to get someone in law enforcement to agree with his brother. Betty Newmer was born Betty LaFon Johnson in 1931 in Ironton, Ohio, a small industrial town sitting along the Ohio River on the border with West Virginia. Her father worked in the coal mines. She graduated from high school in 1949 and within a year had married a young man named Clarence Malone. She was 18. She later told people she had always wanted to leave Ironton, that she was looking for something better than what the town had to offer. The marriage to Malone did not last. Court papers from 1951 show she claimed he had abused her, though what became of that complaint was never clearly established. A son named Gary was born in 1952 from the marriage. The couple separated. What happened to Clarence Malone in the years that followed is a detail that investigators would eventually flag. In November 1970, years after his marriage to Betty had ended and after he had remarried twice, Malone was shot once in the back of the head outside his automobile shop in a small town southwest of Cleveland, Ohio. His death was ruled a homicide. Police noted at the time that there were no signs of robbery. No one was ever charged. By 1960, Betty was in Jacksonville, Florida, enrolled in beauty school under the name Betty Flynn. The last name was that of her second husband, James Flynn, whose background was not detailed fully in the public record, but who was the man who adopted Gary, her son from the first marriage. The marriage to Flynn ended as well, in circumstances that were not publicly established. From Florida, Betty moved further south. Her third husband was a man named Richard Sills. They were together in Florida, and in 1965, Sills was found dead in his apartment in the Florida Keys. Betty told investigators they had been alone together, arguing, when Sills pulled out a gun and shot himself. The death was ruled a suicide. Authorities who were reinvestigating years later said they were looking again at whether that ruling had been correct. 3 years after Sills died, Betty married Harold Gentry. She was in her mid-30s. Harold was a military man. They followed his postings for 21 years before he retired, and they came back to Norwood, North Carolina. By every external measure, Harold was a respected and contented man who had earned his quiet life. His brother Al visited and knew the family, and did not see any of what Harold eventually whispered to him, that something was wrong, that the woman he had married was hiding something important about who she was. Harold Gentry was 49 years old when he was found shot to death in July 1986. Betty collected approximately $20,000 in insurance money from his death. Within 5 years, she had married again. John Newmer was her 5th husband, and she found him in Augusta, Georgia, where she had moved after Harold's death. She had opened a beauty shop in Augusta. People in the community knew her as Bea, an affectionate elderly woman with white hair who attended church and did charitable work, and had apparently endured a difficult life with grace and warmth. Nothing about the way she presented herself in Augusta invited questions about her past. Nobody asked. She had a life insurance policy on John Newmer. He died in October 2007, his death attributed officially to sepsis. Georgia authorities later conducted a review of the case and closed it, concluding there was no evidence she had been involved. His family disputed that conclusion. While living with John Newmer in Augusta in the mid-1990s, Betty had also found another stream of income. She persuaded more than 200 people in the community to invest money in what she described as a legal fund for a wealthy European family that had died without heirs. She told each investor they could expect to receive up to $100,000 for every $100 they contributed. The money, she explained, was needed to navigate the foreign legal system and claim a vast inheritance on their behalf. The scheme drew in more than 200 people across the Augusta area before it collapsed. No heirs were ever found because there were none. In 2008, investigators in Stanley County, North Carolina, reopened the 1986 murder of Harold Gentry. Al Gentry had pressed them for more than 2 decades, and now someone had finally listened. What they found, when they began pulling at the threads of Betty Newmer's life, was a story that law enforcement later described as extraordinarily difficult to reconstruct because so much of it kept shifting. She had used different last names across different decades and different states. She had moved repeatedly, leaving behind communities who knew only the version of herself she chose to present. Piecing together the actual sequence of marriages, deaths, and movements required coordinating records across Ohio, Florida, North Carolina, and Georgia, and even then, significant gaps remained. The charges that emerged from the 2008 investigation were specific and serious. Prosecutors in Stanley County charged Betty Newmer with 3 counts of solicitation to commit first-degree murder. The number was 3 because investigators determined she had approached 3 separate people in the 6 weeks before Harold's death, asking each of them to kill him. The first charge had come from a single solicitation count issued shortly after her arrest in May 2008. As the investigation deepened and more witnesses came forward, the count expanded to 3. Alan Lawrence, the former police officer who had made the calls to Stanley County authorities in the spring of 1986, came forward again now. He told reporters that he had spent 22 years living with the weight of those unanswered calls, wondering every year whether there was anything more he could have done, knowing he had done what he was supposed to do and that it had not been enough to save Harold Gentry's life. A neighbor too said she had been approached and asked if she would be willing to help. The motive prosecutors described was financial, the $20,000 life insurance policy Harold had, and Betty's need for money. Betty was arrested in May 2008. She was 76 years old. The bond was set at $500,000, which was later reduced to $300,000. She posted the lower amount and was released from the Stanley County Jail. From that point forward, she lived on bond, while the case made its way toward trial, a process that stalled and delayed and postponed across the following 3 years. Her health was failing. The legal machinery moved slowly. In 2009, a BBC documentary examined her case. She appeared in it and proclaimed her innocence. She presented herself on camera in the manner she had always presented herself, a small, white-haired grandmother with an unremarkable exterior and a composed demeanor, who had simply endured an unusual amount of loss across her adult life. The documentary asked the question her neighbors in Augusta and North Carolina had not thought to ask, which was whether the pattern of her life had been constructed or simply suffered. Since her arrest, investigators in Florida and Ohio had reopened examinations into several of the suspicious deaths around her. Police in Florida took another look at Richard Sills, whose death in the Keys in 1965 had been ruled as suicide based on Betty's own account of what had happened in that apartment. Ohio investigators began trying to locate records related to Gary Flynn, her son who had been found shot in his apartment in Perry, Ohio in November 1985, his death ruled as suicide. Gary's son, Jeff Carstensen, by then living in Michigan, had told the Associated Press that he had always had questions about his father's death, and that knowing what he knew about his grandmother had only deepened them. Gary's mother, Cecilia Flynn, who had been married to Gary's stepfather, also said the family had questions the investigation had never resolved. Betty had been the beneficiary on Gary's life insurance policy, even though Gary was himself married with children. One by one, these reinvestigated cases were closed without charges. Georgia closed its look at John Newmer. Ohio and Florida did not move forward on the other deaths. The only active charge against Betty Newmer remained the 3 solicitation counts connected to Harold Gentry's 1986 murder. The trial kept being scheduled and then postponed. Her health continued to decline. Al Gentry watched the calendar from his home in Rockwell, North Carolina, and felt the years pressing on him as well. By the time Betty Newmer was approaching the final months of her life, Al himself had suffered a heart attack and a stroke. He carried a portable oxygen tank. He was 67 years old. He told a reporter that he could not keep going much longer, but that he would keep going as long as he had breath, because his brother did not have a voice of his own anymore, and someone needed to speak for him. Betty Newmer died late on a Sunday night, or early the following Monday morning, on June 13, 2011, in a hospital in Louisiana. She had been ill with cancer. She was 79 years old. Her son-in-law, Terry Sanders, who had been married for 38 years to Betty's daughter Peggy, told reporters that she had been tough and had fought through a great deal of pain. Stanley County Sheriff Rick Burris said his office intended to look into the circumstances of her death, to examine the death certificate and ensure everything was in order. There was nothing there, of course, that would change anything. Al Gentry said he was numb. He said she had taken all of her secrets to the grave. The case of Harold Gentry's murder was still open, technically, as an unsolved homicide, but the Stanley County Sheriff later acknowledged they were at a dead end. Harold's killer, whoever that person was, had never been named in a courtroom, had never been convicted, had never faced the question of what had actually happened on July 14, 1986, inside that house in Norwood. Harold had told his brother to never trust that woman. He had said she was not who she said she was. He had said it in the weeks before he died, apparently knowing enough to be afraid but not enough to stop what was already being arranged. Alan Lawrence had then called the sheriff's office and told them what he knew, and nobody had moved quickly enough. 5 husbands across 5 states, across 5 decades. A coal miner's daughter from Ironton, Ohio, who had wanted to leave her hometown for something better, and had kept moving and kept marrying and kept collecting, and had died of cancer in a Louisiana hospital on a Sunday night, while free on bond, before a jury could hear a word of what the prosecution had spent 3 years assembling. The question Al Gentry kept asking in the years after her death was not about Betty at all. He wanted to know who had been the person who walked into that house on July 14, 1986. The person who had actually pulled the trigger. Because Betty Newmer had not been charged with pulling the trigger. She had been charged with paying someone else to do it. That person was never found. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From the American South, our final case travels across the Atlantic to a small town in northern Italy in the years just before the Second World War, where a woman named Leonarda Cianciulli was running a small shop, raising her surviving children, and becoming convinced that the only way to keep her son safe from the approaching war was to offer the lives of 3 of her neighbors to the forces she believed were watching her family. Case 10. Leonarda Cianciulli. Leonarda Cianciulli grew up believing she was cursed. She had grown up with the belief in a particular and personal way, rooted in specific events and specific words said to her at specific moments, and it shaped everything that came after, with a logic that, from inside her understanding of the world, was as solid as any other. She had attempted to take her own life twice before reaching adulthood, once as a young girl and once as a teenager. and the fact that she had survived both attempts seemed to her neither lucky nor miraculous, but simply further evidence of a fate that could not be escaped. A fortune teller she visited as a young woman told her she would marry and have children, but that all her children would die. A palm reader looked at her hands and told her she saw prison in the right and a criminal asylum in the left. She did not dismiss these warnings. She carried them. Born in April 1894 in Montella, a small hill town in the Campania region of southern Italy, Leonarda came from modest circumstances and grew up in a world where superstition and Catholic practice existed alongside each other without much friction, where it was entirely possible to attend Mass and also consult someone about what the cards or the lines of a palm might say. She married Raffaele Pansardi, a clerk in the registry office, in 1917, against her parents' wishes. Her mother, infuriated by the match, reportedly cursed the union. Whether that curse had any power is a question that depends entirely on what a person believes, but the events that followed the marriage were consistent enough with catastrophe that Leonarda came to see them as proof. She had 17 pregnancies across her marriage. 3 ended in miscarriage. Of the 14 children born alive, 10 died when they were very young, from various causes, each death arriving in a different form, but all arriving, each one another confirmation of the pattern she had been warned about. She and Raffaele moved to Lauria, in the Basilicata region, where Leonarda was convicted of fraud in 1927 and served a short prison term. After her release, they were trying to rebuild when the earthquake struck in 1930, destroying their home and giving them no choice but to start again somewhere else. They went north, following the logic of opportunity rather than attachment, and settled in Correggio, a quiet town in the province of Reggio Emilia, set in the wide flat plain of the Po Valley, where the land runs out to the horizon in every direction and the winters come with a grey insistence. In Correggio, Leonarda opened a small shop. She made herself useful to her neighbours, becoming someone people came to for advice and help with practical matters. She had a reputation as someone who perhaps knew a little more than other people, who might be consulted about personal questions. Women in the neighbourhood spoke well of her. She was seen as a good mother, someone who held her surviving children close and treated the community around her with warmth. Nobody who knew her in those years in Correggio would have described her as anything other than a decent, somewhat superstitious woman who had suffered an unusual amount and carried it with composure. Her 4 surviving children were everything to her. The deaths of the 10 others had produced in Leonarda a relationship with the living ones that was shaped entirely by the fear of further loss. She watched them, she worried over them. Whatever protection she could offer, she offered. And then, in late 1939, as the Second World War was spreading across Europe and Italy under Benito Mussolini was moving toward full participation on the side of Germany, her eldest son Giuseppe told her he intended to join the Royal Italian Army. She had already lost 13 pregnancies or infant children. She was 45 years old. The war was killing young men at a scale that made the individual arithmetic of a mother's fear seem almost quaint by comparison. And Leonarda Cianciulli, who had spent her adult life consulting fortune tellers and carrying the weight of prophecy, arrived at a conclusion that was, within the framework of everything she believed, entirely coherent. To keep Giuseppe alive, she would need to offer something in exchange, a life for a life. 3 of them, as it turned out. Her first victim was a woman named Faustina Setti. She was a spinster, alone, without close family, the kind of person who wanted things she had not been able to find on her own. Leonarda knew her from the neighbourhood. Leonarda told Faustina she had arranged a husband for her, a good man in the town of Pola, and that Faustina should prepare to go. She told Faustina to write letters to her friends and family, explaining that she was leaving for a new life, and to tell no one the specific plans before she went, so as not to invite interference. Faustina wrote the letters. She gave them to Leonarda to send. She came to Leonarda's house on December 17, 1939, to say goodbye before her departure. Leonarda gave her wine. The wine had been prepared. Faustina lost consciousness, and Leonarda killed her with an axe. She dismembered the body, cutting it into 9 pieces. She put the pieces into a large pot and added 7 kilograms of caustic soda to dissolve the flesh and bones. When everything had broken down into a liquid, she poured it into buckets and emptied it into the septic tank outside. She collected the blood separately, in a basin. She dried the blood and combined it with flour, sugar, eggs, margarine and chocolate. She baked the mixture into small cakes. She distributed those cakes to people in the neighbourhood. The letters Faustina had written were mailed on schedule. Her friends and family received word that she had gone away for a new life. Nobody came looking immediately. There was, for the time being, nothing to look for. The second victim was Francesca Soavi, a former schoolteacher who had left her teaching post and was looking for new work. Leonardo told her she had arranged a position for her at a school for girls in Piacenza. Like Faustina, Soavi was instructed to write postcards and letters from Correggio explaining her plans, and to tell no one where she was going in advance. She came to Leonardo's house on September 5, 1940. She received wine that had been prepared. She was killed with an axe. The same process followed, the same cauldron, the same caustic soda, the same careful disposal. From Francesca Soavi, Leonardo also received 3,000 lire, money that Soavi had brought with her. The third woman was Virginia Cacioppo, and Virginia's life before she came to Leonardo's attention had been a more distinguished one than either Faustina's or Francesca's. She had been a soprano. She had sung at La Scala, the opera house in Milan that was as prestigious a stage as existed in Italy. By 1940, she had retired from singing and was living in Correggio in the quiet circumstances of someone whose professional peak was behind her. Leonardo told her she had arranged a secretarial position with an impresario in Florence, a mysterious and important figure who needed someone capable and discreet. Virginia was interested. She was told, as the others had been told, to say nothing to anyone about where she was going before she departed. She came to Leonardo's house on September 30th, 1940. What happened to Virginia Cacioppo in that house followed the same sequence. But Virginia had a sister-in-law who was paying attention. When Virginia disappeared, her sister-in-law, who had seen Virginia going into Leonardo Cianciulli's home not long before her disappearance, became suspicious. Virginia had not written to say she had arrived anywhere, had not sent word that she had taken up the new position, had not been in contact in the way she would have been if she had simply moved to Florence for work. The sister-in-law brought her concerns to the superintendent of police in Reggio Emilia and told them what she had seen. Commissioner Serrao opened an investigation. Suspicions moved quickly to Leonardo. When investigators searched her home, they found the personal belongings of the 3 missing women. They found 3 axes. They found 2 knives. They found the cauldron. They found enough to make the situation clear even before a full account had been given. Leonardo initially denied everything. She denied knowing what had happened to the women, denied any involvement, held her position. But then investigators suggested that her son Giuseppe might have had a role in the disappearances. That changed everything. She could not allow Giuseppe to be implicated in something she had done in order to protect him. She gave a full and detailed confession. She provided investigators with every particular of what had happened in her home across those months. How she had approached each woman, what she had promised them, what she had given them to drink, what she had done with the axe, what she had done with the cauldron and the caustic soda, what she had done with the blood. She told them she had made the cakes and given them to neighbors. At some point during the investigation, she demonstrated that she had been physically capable of carrying out the dismemberment alone, without assistance, by performing the process on a corpse at a local morgue. It took her 12 minutes. She described all of this not with evident distress or shame, but with the manner of someone who had performed a task correctly and completely and was accounting for it with accuracy. She believed she had protected Giuseppe. She said so, plainly and without apology. She had offered 3 lives to ensure one would be spared. Giuseppe Pansardi survived the war. The trial was held in Reggio Emilia in 1946. Leonardo Cianciulli was 52 years old. She came into the courtroom and sat and listened to the account of her crimes as the prosecution laid it out. At certain points, she corrected what was being said. A news account written at the time described her gripping the witness stand rail with small and oddly delicate hands and setting the prosecutor straight on specific details, her eyes carrying what the account described as a kind of wild inner pride. She told the court, among other things, that she had donated the copper ladle she had used to skim the fat from the top of the cauldron to Italy's wartime metal collection drives, because the country had been badly in need of metal in the last period of the war. She seemed to consider this a relevant contribution to offer. She expressed no remorse. She had done what needed doing, she had done it competently, and she had done it for her son. That was the account she gave, and she did not revise it under questioning. She was found guilty of all 3 murders. The sentence handed down was 30 years in prison, followed by 3 years in a criminal asylum. The total was 33 years. The palm reader who had told her decades earlier that she saw prison in her right hand and a criminal asylum in her left had been correct on both counts. In prison, she was described by those who watched her as quiet and cooperative. a model prisoner who occupied herself with crocheting and, occasionally, baking. The baking was noted by contemporaries without elaboration, but nobody who knew her history was especially interested in sampling what she made. She died on October 15, 1970, in the Women's Criminal Asylum at Pozzuoli, near Naples, from a brain hemorrhage. She was in her mid-70s. She had spent the better part of 30 years in custody, serving a sentence whose duration she had been told about, in rough terms, by a woman who had read her hands long before she had given anyone cause to prosecute her. Her cauldron, her axes, her knives, and the other implements found at her home in Correggio were taken into custody by the public prosecutor's office in Reggio Emilia and eventually transferred to the Criminological Museum in Rome, where they remain on display. The cauldron is the object most people come to see. It is large and iron and sits there among the documentation of the case without comment. It is enough by itself. Leonarda Cianciulli had told anyone who would listen that she was cursed. She had collected the evidence of that curse across 17 pregnancies and 40 years of loss and grief and displacement. She had consulted the people who read the future, and she had heard what they told her, and she had taken it seriously. And in the autumn of 1939, when her son came home and told her he was going to war, she had sat with everything she believed about fate and sacrifice and the debt that living people owe to the forces watching over them, and she had decided that the only way to keep him alive was to offer the lives of 3 women she had known from her neighborhood in exchange. Giuseppe came home from the war. The 3 women did not come home from Leonarda's house. Whether those 2 facts are connected in any way other than the one Leonarda Cianciulli believed they were is a question that has no answer. What is documented is the cauldron, and the 7 kilograms of caustic soda, and the cakes that the neighbors ate. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.